Welcome back, you sacred contradiction, you quiet cataclysm disguised as gentleness, you impossible depth they tried to measure with tools far too small to comprehend what was forming inside you. Welcome back to the observers, the trainers, the self-appointed guardians, who truly believed they had decoded your trajectory simply because they had witnessed fragments of your earlier phases, as if partial data ever gave anyone the authority to predict the evolution of someone built from experiences none of them could have survived. They treated your pauses like warnings, your silence like suppression, your healing like camouflage. They charted your reactions with mechanical precision, convinced the shape of your pain dictated the shape of your future. They catalogued your resilience as if resilience was synonymous with exhaustion rather than rebirth. They studied your wounds with clinical detachment, treating each scar like evidence of a collapse that must eventually arrive. They misread your patience as weakness, your compassion as vulnerability, your introspection as instability. They were so certain they understood you that they didn't even consider the possibility that what they were interpreting was nothing more than their own projections placed onto someone whose depth far exceeded their comprehension. They prepared for your downfall with the seriousness of people anticipating a breach in the foundation, rehearsing scripts for interventions, refining protocols for containment, crafting narratives where they would eventually point and say, "We were right about them all along." They studied your wounds the way inexperienced astronomers observe unknown celestial bodies, fearfully, obsessively, with the assumption that gravity must equal danger. They analyzed every fracture as if breaking inevitably leads to bitterness, never realizing that breaks can also lead to breakthroughs. They convinced themselves that pain always produces destruction because they had only ever witnessed those who surrendered to their wounds instead of alchemizing them. In their minds, everything about you pointed toward one conclusion. They were preparing to confront a villain. They believed you were destined to become the force that justified their alarm, their caution, their hierarchy. They built entire frameworks around the danger they imagined, frameworks built on fear rather than insight. They prepared themselves to be the heroes, the saviors, the rational voices ready to intervene when you finally turned. But when the moment came, the moment they expected you to erupt, you did something their manuals, their predictions, their psychological rehearsals never accounted for. You arrived holy. Not symbolic holiness, not ceremonial holiness, not the kind dependent on ritual or ceremony. You arrived with holiness that forms itself in the bones of someone who has walked through devastation without letting devastation define them. You arrived with a kind of holiness that radiates from someone who survived what should have hardened them, but instead deepened them. You arrived with a presence that didn't ask for acknowledgement because it didn't need it. The second they saw you, the second they felt the quiet density around you, their script, every line, every assumption, every warning, they all caught fire. You did not match the silhouette they trained to fight. They trained for a destroyer, and you showed up as a sanctuary. They trained to confront a threat, and you arrived as a horizon. They trained to restrain a monster, and you walked in with a presence so grounded, so centered, so unmistakably intact that it shook the foundation of their training. They expected the atmosphere to darken around you, but instead it clarified. They expected to feel tension around you, but instead they felt recognition. They expected to prepare for impact, but instead they were forced into reflection. That was the beginning of their unraveling. They had prepared countermeasures for anger, not for peace. They had strategies for rage, not for stillness. They had studied how to fight someone who lashes out, not someone who dissolves conflict by simply existing outside of it. They understood danger woven from fury, not danger woven from understanding. And your evolution was forged from understanding so profound, it became its own form of power. They trained to destroy a god-eating entity, some imagined devourer of all things sacred, a being whose hunger threatened cosmic order. But you did not show up hungry. You showed up whole. You showed up as the tender void, a depth that does not consume through greed, but through gravity. You showed up as the place where even divinity pauses, not out of fear, but out of reverence. You became the one thing they had never trained for. A being who didn't fit any category, didn't match any warning, didn't trigger any defensive protocol. They created hierarchies built on the belief that they would one day need to protect the world from you, when in truth they never understood that you were the one who would one day protect the world from them, not through force, but through example. They misinterpreted your softness as instability because they had never experienced softness that wasn't fragile. They misinterpreted your quiet as absence because they had never met quiet that held entire universes behind its eyes. They misinterpreted your empathy as naivety because they had never witnessed empathy that evolved into discernment. They trained to block your destruction, never imagining that your existence would instead expose theirs. And this is where their hierarchy began to melt, where their structure began to bend beneath the weight of a truth they had never prepared for. They took defensive positions expecting a battlefield, but you brought a presence that dissolved conflict without needing to assert dominance. They entered their roles with shields raised, expecting the kind of confrontation that validates fear. But you arrived in a way that rendered their shields symbolic. They assumed they were preparing for a descent, but you were in the middle of an ascension they were too limited to anticipate. They didn't realize until that moment that they had not been preparing for you. They had been preparing to protect themselves from their own assumptions. Your presence exposed the flaw in their predictions. You had outgrown every scenario they rehearsed. They trained themselves to recognize danger, but they never trained themselves to recognize transcendence. They expected you to act like a threat, but you acted like a threshold to a reality where power is not drawn from domination, but from integration, a threshold to a version of existence where depth dismantles hierarchy with more precision than force ever could. They stood there armed with strategies for conflict, and you stood there carrying resolution. They stood there projecting fear, and you stood there reflecting truth. They stood there waiting for you to become what they feared, and you stood there revealing what they refused to see. Their fear was never about you. It was about their lack of understanding, and the realization hit them with more force than any outburst ever could. They had trained for the wrong being. They had prepared to confront someone who never existed. They had armed themselves against a future that was never going to arrive. They were ready to fight an enemy made of their own imagination, while the real version of you walked in untouched by their predictions. And the most devastating part, you didn't walk in with triumph. You didn't walk in with superiority. You didn't walk in with aggression. You walked in as someone who didn't need to defend their evolution, because evolution that real doesn't need defense. You walked in carrying an inner world so coherent, so precise, so stabilized that their entire hierarchy buckled under the pressure of being seen by someone they never expected to understand them. You didn't destroy their hierarchy. You revealed it, revealed how fragile it was, revealed how fear-based it was. revealed how dependent it was on the idea that you would one day justify their caution. And once they saw that truth, once they saw what you had actually become, they could no longer pretend they were the ones in control of the story. Their structure didn't collapse because you attacked it. It collapsed because it was never strong enough to stand in the presence of someone who had transcended everything it was built upon. What followed next wasn't chaos. It was exposure. Exposure of how unprepared they were for a presence that didn't respond to their projections. Exposure of how much they relied on the assumption that you would remain predictable. Exposure of how deeply their identity depended on the idea that they were the ones who understood you best. They didn't realize until that moment that they had never been observing you. They had been observing their own fears reflected back at them through the cracks of your early phases. And when you evolved beyond those phases, when you became something that refused to fit the parameters they built around you, they couldn't simply update their expectations. Their entire worldview had to shift. And shifting a worldview is far more devastating than confronting a threat. A threat can be neutralized. A worldview must be dismantled piece by piece, and your very existence initiated that dismantling with a precision no force could replicate. They stood there staring at you, experiencing the discomfort of realizing that the person in front of them wasn't the person they trained for, wasn't the person they anticipated, wasn't even the person they once judged. You had become someone who didn't need to prove they weren't dangerous because your presence alone redefined what danger meant. You embodied a version of danger that wasn't destructive. It was clarifying. A version of danger that didn't burn. It revealed. A version of danger that didn't instill fear. It instilled awareness. And awareness is far more destabilizing than fear. Fear can be controlled, weaponized, redirected. But awareness? Awareness forces people to confront themselves. Awareness forces them to examine their own motives, their own projections, their own insecurities, and you. Just by standing there, just by existing in your new coherence, became a mirror that reflected back every assumption they ever made. For the first time, they had to wonder if the villain they prepared for was ever real, or if it was simply the shadow of their own limitations. That realization pulled the ground out from beneath them, because if they were wrong about who you would become, what else were they wrong about? Their hierarchy wasn't built on wisdom. It was built on predicted outcomes. Their structure wasn't built on insight. It was built on preparing for the worst. Their authority wasn't built on truth. It was built on managing what they believed was inevitable. But when the inevitable didn't arrive, when the villain they studied never manifested, their authority lost its foundation. They weren't protectors anymore. They were miscalculators. They weren't guardians. They were spectators incapable of interpreting what they saw. They weren't leaders. They were merely individuals who believed they had advanced knowledge when all they had were recycled fears dressed as prophecy. And your presence, your calm, anchored, expansive presence, didn't just challenge their authority, it dismantled it. That is the moment they realized they had not prepared for you at all. They had prepared for a version of themselves they projected onto you. They expected you to break because they had broken under far less. They expected you to harden because they had hardened under experiences far lighter than yours. They expected you to descend because descent was the path they chose when their own pain surfaced. They expected you to lash out because lashing out is what they did when confronted with their own truth. But you didn't mirror their path. You built your own. And building your own path is always more threatening to those who depend on predictability. When a person follows a predictable pattern, they can be managed. They can be labeled. They can be placed into a category that feels safe for everyone else. But when a person evolves beyond the categories, when their identity expands beyond the boundaries others rely on to feel secure, that person becomes an unpredictable force, not because they are dangerous, but because they are sovereign. Your sovereignty frightened them far more than any aggression ever could. Aggression can be deflected. Sovereignty cannot. Sovereignty stands on its own terms. Sovereignty moves without permission. Sovereignty chooses without fear. Sovereignty answers to truth, not expectation. And your sovereignty rose quietly, steadily, unshakably, forcing them to confront a version of themselves they had spent years avoiding. The version that doesn't understand you. The version that cannot predict you. The version that cannot influence you. The version that has no power over you. Their entire structure was built on the idea that they knew what they were dealing with. But when you walked in and overturned that assumption with nothing more than your presence, you didn't just disrupt their strategy, you erased their relevance. That is the wound they couldn't tolerate. Not that you evolved beyond their predictions, but that you evolved beyond their usefulness. They weren't ready to face a being who no longer needed managing, interpreting, or explaining. You stood before them not as a threat, but as evidence that their fear-based training was hollow. And evidence is far more dangerous than resistance, because evidence demands accountability. Evidence demands recalibration. Evidence demands truth. And truth is something their hierarchy had never been designed to accommodate. They designed their structure around the anticipation of your collapse. But when you refused to collapse, when you instead expanded into a form so coherent it forced them to see themselves clearly for the first time, they experienced a collapse far worse than anything they assumed you would cause. When their worldview collapsed, their hierarchy followed. When their hierarchy followed, their identity cracked. And when their identity cracked, they finally understood why your existence felt so threatening. You were never the danger. You were the correction. And corrections terrify those who built their entire sense of power on predictions that were never true. You didn't walk in to fight them. You didn't walk in to overpower them. You didn't walk in to reclaim anything. You walked in carrying yourself with such alignment that their entire structure felt outdated in comparison. You walked in with a presence so stable that their entire strategy dissolved in its light. You walked in as the embodiment of what they never believed was possible. A being who healed without becoming hardened, who expanded without becoming arrogant, who rose without needing to be celebrated. You walked in as someone who had mastered themselves. And once a person masters themselves, no hierarchy built on fear can survive their presence. That realization did something catastrophic to them. They didn't lose control of you. They lost control of the classification they depended on to define you. Without classification, they had no structure. Without structure, they had no authority. Without authority, they had no purpose. And you, without doing anything, became the catalyst for their collapse. Your existence became the lesson they never asked for, but desperately needed. A lesson that their fear was never insight. A lesson that their predictions were never truth. A lesson that their hierarchy was never stability. It was a reaction to their own internal fragility. And once that realization took root in their minds, something deeper began to unravel inside them. Something they had never prepared for in all their training, drills, and ritualistic simulations. They expected a villain, but what they faced was exposure. Not exposure brought through confrontation, but exposure brought through comparison. You weren't attacking them, you were revealing them. They finally understood that the danger was never that you'd become destructive. The danger was that you'd become clear. Clear in your decisions, clear in your identity, clear in your presence. Nothing rattles a fearful hierarchy faster than a person who cannot be miscategorized, misunderstood, or misinterpreted. And the moment you walked in holding yourself with that quiet, grounded depth, their entire foundation shivered because clarity always collapses anything built on fear. They had designed entire frameworks around fighting the creature they assumed you were destined to become. They trained to confront a threat with teeth and fury, a being who fed on divinity, a force that could swallow all light in its path. They prepared strategies for confrontation, for aggression, for the kind of presence that floods a room with intensity. But the one thing they never prepared for was the presence you actually embodied. A holy calm that dissolved conflict instead of generating it. You entered not as someone trying to overpower them, but as someone who had outgrown the need to prove anything. And that was far more frightening because it made them confront the truth that their entire hierarchy was based on a misread narrative. They didn't just misunderstand who you would become. They built an entire identity around that misunderstanding. They expected you to arrive like a blast of chaos, but you showed up like the tender void, the kind of depth that doesn't pull through hunger, but through gravity. They prepared for a force that devoured sacredness, but you walked in, holding a presence where sacredness rests. They expected you to consume everything around you, but instead you became the still center, where everything around you had to rearrange itself. They had manuals for a threat that tears, claws, or rages. They had diagrams, charts, and contingency roles for each predicted behavior. But how do you confront someone who carries holiness not as a symbol, but as a frequency? How do you counter someone whose presence doesn't escalate, but reveals? How do you fight someone who stands so firmly in their own nature that every blade aimed at them feels pointless before it even moves? They didn't train for that. They didn't prepare for the possibility that the being they feared was never a devourer of gods, but the quiet field from which gods themselves draw nourishment. They trained for an eater. You showed up as the place even the divine consumes from, not through dominance but through depth. And that depth tore through their hierarchy like fire through a paper fortress. Because what burns a hierarchy isn't violence, it's irrelevance. When a structure realizes it is no longer needed, it collapses from within. And that is what your presence triggered. An inward collapse, a quiet meltdown, a recognition that their theories, their warnings, their predictions were nothing but shadows cast by their own misunderstanding. You were no longer a figure they could prepare for. You were a force they had to reorient around. Not a threat to be neutralized, but a truth that demanded evolution. And truth is always harder to confront than danger. Danger is simple. Aim, attack, defend. Truth is complicated. Reflect, adjust, transform. They weren't ready for transformation. They were ready for battle. But the moment they saw you, unbothered, unshaken, aligned, they realized battle was impossible. Not because you were too powerful to fight, but because you had stepped into a dimension they could not reach through conflict. Their training was built around confrontation. Your evolution was built around transcendence. They trained to destroy a monster. You became a horizon. They trained to contain a threat. You became a presence without edges. They trained to identify danger. You became something that dissolves danger by simply not participating in it. And in that moment, when their hierarchy realized you were operating from a place beyond the reach of their defensive mechanisms, the meltdown began. Quiet at first, internal, psychological. Their minds scrambled, trying to make sense of something that had no precedent. They had no tactic for holiness. They had no response for reverence. They had no defense against a person who radiates coherence instead of chaos. They found themselves in the presence of something they couldn't control, not because it was untamed, but because it was complete. And completeness is the one thing that invalidates every fear-based structure from the inside out. Your presence forced them to face their own incompleteness, and the human psyche, when confronted with completeness that doesn't belong to it, reacts with collapse. Not the collapse of destruction, but the collapse of all false roles and identities. Their status didn't fall because you challenged it. It fell because standing next to you made their status feel hollow. Their authority didn't erode because you resisted it. It eroded because their authority only existed in environments where misunderstanding reigned, and misunderstanding died the moment you entered the room. Their fear didn't spike because you were dangerous. It spiked because you were unmistakably, undeniably, uncontrollably holy. And holiness, real holiness, the kind forged through destruction, survived, and wounds alchemized, does not bend for hierarchy. It erodes it. It dissolves anything built on ego. It exposes any structure built on misconception, and that exposure spread through them like a thin, suffocating heat. The heat of recognition. Recognition that they had not prepared for a villain. They had prepared for their own reflection. They thought you would shatter as they once shattered. You didn't. They thought you would harden as they once hardened. You didn't. They thought you would lash out as they once lashed out. You didn't. You emerged radiant, not because life was kind to you, but because you refused to let cruelty dictate your evolution, and that evolution, the one they never saw coming, burned through their hierarchy like a long-overdue correction. They trained for fury. You showed up holy. They trained for hunger. You showed up whole. They trained for destruction. You showed up as the place from which creation breathes. They trained to protect themselves from you. You revealed they needed protection from themselves. They had spent years preparing for the monster they fantasized about, unaware that the real danger was the mirror you quietly became. A mirror that did not accuse but reflected. A mirror that did not condemn but clarified. A mirror that forced them to see every fear they had projected onto you as their own unclaimed shadow. And that realization was the real meltdown, not the collapse of authority, but the collapse of illusion, because illusion cannot survive contact with someone who has outgrown it. You are not the villain they trained to fight. You are the truth they never anticipated confronting. You are not the God-eater they feared. You are the tender void that gods return to when they are tired of being worshipped. You are not a destroyer. You are a field where anything false suffocates and anything real expands. And in that field, their entire trained identity began to dissolve. They saw themselves clearly for the first time, not as protectors, but as prisoners of their own expectations. And seeing that truth was something they couldn't unsee. It burned through them, not violently, but relentlessly. It stripped their roles. It stripped their certainty. It stripped every layer they had built to feel authoritative. And once stripped, they were left staring at the truth that had always terrified them. They had never been preparing for you. They had been preparing to control the version of themselves they projected onto you. They had trained to destroy a villain because they were afraid of confronting their own capacity for darkness. They had trained to fight a devourer because they feared their own hunger for control. They had trained to defend themselves from chaos because they feared their own internal disarray. You were never the opponent, you were the reflection. And that is where the deepest fracture formed, because once a hierarchy realizes its greatest fear is itself, there is no training rigorous enough to bring it back into alignment. They could no longer hide behind their doctrines, their simulations, their warnings, or their carefully curated profiles of who they believed you would become. All those years of study weren't preparation. They were avoidance. They weren't guarding the world from you. They were guarding themselves from the truth that someone like you, someone who experienced far more pressure, far more pain, far more distortion, chose to evolve rather than imitate. You forced them to face the question they had buried for so long. Why didn't they evolve the same way? Why didn't they rise the same way? Why didn't they become someone who transcended rather than reacted? Every moment you stood in that unwavering presence, they felt themselves shrinking. Not because you diminished them, but because they finally saw the limitations they had allowed to calcify inside them. You didn't walk in reminding them of their failures. Your existence reminded them of their choices. They saw in you every route they avoided, every lesson they resisted, every truth they refused to integrate. You became living evidence that you can survive everything they justified as reasons to collapse and still emerge aligned. You became proof that they were wrong, not just about you, but about themselves. And when a hierarchy built on fear realizes that its entire authority is rooted in misinterpretation, the collapse is not loud. It is quiet. Quiet in the way a foundation cracks as long before a building falls. Quiet in the way a person exhales when they realize the story they've been rehearsing no longer applies. Quiet in the way truth reveals instability without needing to shout. Your presence did not demand their collapse. It exposed the hollowness already present in their structure. They could no longer pretend that your evolution was unpredictable. It was only unpredictable to those who never paid attention to who you were becoming. You didn't betray the path they imagined for you. Their imagination was too small. You didn't step outside their predictions. Their predictions were confined by fear, not understanding. They had studied your pain, convinced it would harden you. They had studied your restraint, convinced it would eventually snap. They had studied your reactions, convinced they could forecast your future based on your past. But they never studied your capacity. Capacity is not found in scars. Capacity is found in the choices scars force you to make. Some choose destruction, some choose numbness, some choose pretense. But you, your capacity, revealed itself in transformation. You held every fragment, every wound, every disappointment, and you did not let any of it become a weapon you pointed outward. You chose to become a space where healing reorganized itself into something coherent. And that coherence was the very thing they were unprepared for. Coherence is dangerous to a structure built on misinterpretation because it removes the room for guesswork. They could no longer manipulate the story. They could no longer claim foresight. They could no longer pretend that their authority came from awareness. You walked in with a presence that invalidated every label they had created to protect themselves from seeing you clearly. And the more clearly they saw you, the more deeply they felt the collapse inside themselves. They had prepared for a villain who would roar, but you spoke with a gentleness so precise it cauterized every assumption. They had prepared for a devourer who would consume, but you radiated a fullness so complete it dissolved every projection before it reached you. They had prepared to face someone who would destabilize their order. Instead, they faced someone whose very presence transformed their order into something outdated. You weren't the danger they predicted. You were the evolution they weren't capable of embodying. That realization was the true meltdown, not the fear of being harmed, but the fear of becoming irrelevant. They had built their authority on the belief that they understood you better than you understood yourself. They had convinced themselves they were the stabilizing force in your story. But when you entered the room, stable in ways they didn't even know how to describe, their authority evaporated. Because authority that depends on misunderstanding never survives clarity. And clarity walked in with you. It walked in with the quiet steadiness of someone who had earned their identity through fire, not through theory. It carried a gravity that didn't demand respect. It commanded it naturally. Their training failed not because you defied their expectations, but because your evolution outgrew their imagination. They imagined you would become something monstrous. They imagined you would become something destructive. They imagined you would become something that justified their fear. But your evolution revealed they were terrified not of what you could become, but of what you did become. A being who didn't rise through dominance, but through depth. Because depth dismantles every structure built on insecurity. You didn't swallow their hierarchy. You made it transparent. You didn't challenge their authority. You made their authority irrelevant. You didn't reduce their positions. You made their positions unnecessary. You didn't burn their script. Their script caught fire the moment they realized the villain they trained to fight never existed outside their projections. There is no defense against someone who offers no threat. There is no weapon effective against someone who doesn't attack. There is no strategy for someone who stands rooted in genuine alignment. They learned the hard truth. You cannot train to fight holiness. Holiness does not fight. It reveals. And revealed they were, not the powerful evaluators they pretended to be, but frightened interpreters of their own assumptions. They didn't train for the version of you who survived without becoming hardened. They trained for the version who didn't survive. They trained for the collapse, not the resurrection. And resurrection is always terrifying to those who expected a corpse. When someone rises in a direction no one prepared for, their rise does more than inspire. It exposes. Your rise exposed the cracks in their logic, the limitations in their perspective, the fragility in their confidence. They had prepared to meet a threat. Instead, they met truth. They had prepared to contain a monster. Instead, they met maturity. They had prepared to restrain chaos. Instead, they met clarity. You arrived holy, and holiness reorders everything simply by existing. They expected you to demand acknowledgement, but you didn't. You didn't need validation because you had internalized validation long before they ever noticed your growth. You didn't seek applause because you had outgrown the need for external confirmation. You didn't crave recognition because recognition is a hunger only found in those who are unsure of themselves. You walked in with certainty woven into your breath. And certainty unnerves those whose identities depend on uncertainty in others. They expected violence, but you offered stillness. They expected volatility, but you offered depth. They expected darkness, but you offered clarity. They expected rage, but you offered coherence. And coherence is more devastating than rage because it removes the opportunity for misinterpretation. They could no longer twist your actions into warnings. They could no longer turn your emotions into evidence. They could no longer narrate your evolution as a descent. You are not descending. You are expanding. And nothing terrifies a hierarchy more than a person who expands beyond its borders. Their doctrine told them to fear your power. Your presence revealed they should fear their ignorance. Their training taught them to control your potential. Your clarity revealed they should master their own. They had been preparing to defend themselves from you. But the truth was they needed to defend themselves from their own limitations. And limitations do not surrender gracefully. They cling, they resist, they panic, they crumble. And crumble they did, not in the dramatic, catastrophic way they expected from you, but in the slow, humiliating way that comes from realizing they were wrong at every step. You didn't cause the meltdown. You revealed it. You didn't trigger the collapse. You simply stopped shrinking to fit inside their predictions. And once you stopped shrinking, their structure couldn't hold the truth of who you had become. You were no longer someone they could analyze. You were someone they had to acknowledge. You were no longer someone they could predict. You were someone they had to respect. You were no longer someone they could control. You were someone they could no longer define. And definitions were the only thing they had ever relied on. Without definitions, they were lost. Without predictions, they were powerless. Without classifications, they were irrelevant. And irrelevance is the wound no hierarchy survives. They had trained to fight a villain. They had prepared speeches, strategies, interventions. But you, holy, tender, grounded, you didn't show up as the villain they feared. You showed up as the void that dissolves fear by revealing its origin. You showed up as the quiet space where divinity rests. You showed up as the presence that reorders without force. You didn't fight them. You didn't overpower them. You didn't argue with them. You walked in carrying a reality bigger than their entire doctrine. And reality does not bow. Reality does not negotiate. Reality does not shrink. Reality simply is. And your being, was enough to dismantle everything they built. Not through destruction, but through revelation. And now, facing the truth without the shield of their interpretations, without the comfort of their predictions, without the safety of their doctrines, they are left with the final realization: the meltdown they feared was never yours. It was theirs, and the aftermath of that meltdown, the silence that follows the collapse of misinterpretation, the reorganization that begins when truth finally settles into the space fear once occupied. That is where this story completes itself. But the completion is not the end. It is the beginning of what emerges when the world finally adjusts to the truth of who you are. And that emergence arrives now.